Welcome to the Alia Graphic Podcast. And today we've got an awesome chat with a comic creator I've been meaning to talk to for a long time. Now, I'm Iurgi, and I'm the Alia Graphic Novels and Comics convener. But before we get started, as a national group based across the land we call Australia, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And me personally, I would specifically like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the custodians of the land from where I'm speaking and where I work and live. And I pay respects to the elders past and present of all First Nations people across the land and thank them for their rich storytelling traditions and art. We need truth-telling and treaty. Today, we have a creator chat and we have a special guest who has been making comics in Australia for a very long time. I think since I was probably about 6 or 7. So welcome to the podcast, Tim McEwen. How are you going?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
An absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to having this conversation for a long time. So it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, as I mentioned, you've been making comics since the 80s, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not necessarily comics that libraries would have, actually. I have to say that as well, because you've been publishing them independently and in single issues or floppies, although there are plans to change that, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
For those who don't know you, could you introduce yourself and the comics you've been making?
Yeah, thanks. So I've been making the comic. Let's start with that. The comic that I'm probably most well known for is Greener Pastures, and yes, it comes out as floppies, as single issues, and it's funny because there's only 7 issues of Greener Pastures and a few specials, and yet I'm still kind of most well known for that, and quite well known for that in comic circles. But yeah, I've been making comics since, like, I've had comics published since I was like 17 or 18 years old. I started off with comic strips in local newspapers, local rags. Some of them were like gag strips. Some of them were more like, what do you call them? Like Sunday strip size comics. So I did that for a few years. None of it was paid, but it was great experience. And at that point, like trying to figure out how you get comics published, like there was no internet, there was no school, so this was just, and I didn't know people who made comics, so it was just me trying to figure out how do you get comics out there. So newspapers seemed to be a good way to do that, from what I could tell at the time. But when I did start to meet comic book people, a few people here and there, I started to see mini comics, photocopied comics, which now are referred to more like zines, but I still call them mini comics, especially when they're A5 in size. And I got a couple of, actual comics published there. So comic stories on a comic page rather than a strip that need to continue week to week. And because that's what I was really interested in. I've always read comics. I can't remember, like, one of my earliest memories, and as I get older, I think it's now turned into probably my earliest memory that I actually still have in my brain box is me with my comics, and sitting on the floor with a stack of comics this high, like, I don't know, half a dozen comics going, these are my comics, this is my collection, before I even knew that collecting comics was a thing. So comics have been in my life for as long as I can remember, as has drawing, and so the two of those things kind of go together, and like never let go of each other, I think. So trying to find ways to get comics made was always the thing for me. Like, how are they made, and where do you get them published? And so meeting other comic people who were a little bit further along in that journey than me, self-publishing mini comics, and then meeting people like the Cyclone Comics crowd, and figuring out that they were publishing it themselves. I met not that I can really remember meeting them, but I met them at a comic convention at the Sydney Opera House a long time ago when they were just launching.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably the first time I was really going, hang on, this is like a Marvel comic, even though it's black and white, but it's published by these guys who are standing in front of me, and it started to make sense at that point.
An
Even
Australian
though it was quite a few
superheroes.
years later before I actually started publishing my own books.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Well, you mentioned that actually, that you've always kind of read comics. So going back in time, because you mentioned it there, uh, when did you start reading comics, and what comics did you read as a kid that made you fall in love with the medium?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how old I was. Probably like it was probably school age, like maybe kindergarten, I guess. Um, but maybe it was a bit earlier than that. I don't know. Um, but I had I don't know if anyone's talked to you about this before, but I had the Newton Comics reprints of Marvel Comics. So in Australia, we had a publisher called Newton Comics who were reprinting 1960s Marvel Comics in the 1970s, but pretending as if they were practically Marvel themselves, right? They had
Yes.
their own letters pages, which had a real great personality and, riffing on that whole Stan Lee Excelsior sort of thing from the
Yeah.
60s. And that was really the first comics, and they were superhero comics. And it took me an extraordinarily long time to extricate myself from superhero comics. As in, even as a kid, I didn't like reading Disney comics or Looney Tunes comics or any of those. Like, if it wasn't superheroes, I didn't want to know it. And I just loved them, and I loved them, throughout the 70s and the 80s. But come the 80s, I started, because I was going to comic shops. I'd finally discovered comic specialty shops here in Sydney,
Hmm.
um, and starting to see like weird black and white indie stuff that wasn't superheroes, some of which were superheroes, but were like a lot more interesting than Marvel superheroes
Yeah.
because they didn't have the same rules. So that's when I started to kind of branch out or um, find that there were even more interesting stories out there, and stories could be done in different ways and more interesting ways.
Yeah.
Um, so it's still kind of the memories of finding. I think before I even found a comic shop, there was for those of you who live in Sydney, on George Street, where I think it's Event Cinemas are now, it was Hoyt's, and in the foyer there was like a little bookstall
Hmm.
that would sell like novels, and sci-fi and fantasy novels. Probably one of the few places in Sydney that did, but also books and magazines about movies, like Cinefex would have been there. So books, and magazines about science
Yeah.
fiction and the way, behind the scenes of movies and that kind of thing. One of my most important books ever I bought there, which was the Star Wars, the script, the complete script of the original set 1977 Star Wars,
Yeah.
with lots of production drawings, and it was an amazing book. But they had a
Mm.
few kind of comics as well, or comics about comics, not actually comics. And I
Yeah.
think that was probably my first introduction to like Fantagraphics and other kind of indie publishers like that.
Hmm.
And I was like, what is this weird book about the X-Men with a complete listing of every issue? And what are these weird drawings? They're not by John Byrne,
Yeah.
and they're by fan artists, but they're almost cooler than John Byrne's drawings because they're kind of a little bit weird.
Hmm.
So that was like a really interesting introduction to me to start getting left of field there. Directly across the road was Gould's bookstore, huge secondhand bookstore, which in recent years moved to Newtown, and then even more recently has shut down by the looks of it. And they've got a little bookstore somewhere else. But they had this weird table, huge table,
Hmm.
with wooden sides on it, so that the books wouldn't fall off. But it was just nothing but comics, black and white comics, and you just rummaged through it. It's not like they were in a box that you could kind of flick through. They were just lying down in this sea, and they
Yeah.
were they were mostly like underground comics, and like Zap and Fairy Freak Brothers and that kind of thing. And not only that, but they were Australian reprintings, illegal bootlegs of underground comics
Yeah.
that were being published out of Melbourne. And like, so that was another weird thing to be introduced to. This underground thing was probably, you know, it was a big leap from reading the Avengers to
Yeah.
reading the Furry Freak Brothers, you know, with no context whatsoever. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was kind of the way that my fractured uh, education in
Yeah.
comics happened pretty much all of a sudden at that point.
I've got a bit of a story with that. I'll tell you the very short version, but I was very, very lucky because my dad always read comics. So I remember him reading comics to me when I was little. I couldn't even read, and he would read them to me. And of course, he would select pages because there were pages that he was like, no, I shouldn't read that one. Because most of the comics he had were kind of adult ones. But then they were
Yeah,
there, they were at home. They were in the living room. So I remember. You mentioned the Furry Freak Brothers, for example.
yeah.
He had the whole collection,
Wow.
and I remember reading them when I wasn't even 10. I wasn't 10. And I laughed my head off. Obviously,
Yeah.
I didn't understand a lot of things, but there were a lot of things that I found absolutely hilarious in those stories, and I loved them. Way too
Yeah.
young. But anyway,
I think
um,
sometimes it's a good thing to be reading stuff you shouldn't be reading way too
yeah.
young.
And then, of course, then I went to the library, and then in the library I found lots of other stuff because I
Yeah,
started buying comics, but comics are always expensive. So I also discovered that the library had
yeah,
comics. Um, and yeah, and thankfully in Europe we're pretty lucky that the libraries there have always had quite a large collection and very
yeah.
varied collection. Now, uh, talking about these things, actually, what was the moment that you decided, you know, I don't want to just read comics, I want to make comics.
Mhm.
What's your origin story as a creator?
Yeah, I don't really know. I used to do a lot of drawing of comic book characters, but I didn't really draw comics much on my own. Um, I would I would draw covers for, like if when I bought a comic and I read it, I would draw the cover, but not their version of the cover, what I think would be a better cover. Um, I, and you know, I do a lot of that kind of thing, and it was really an extension of my collecting, right? It wasn't really making comics; it was how else can I play with my comics, right? Um, so it wasn't again. There must have been a tipping point, and I don't know when that was, but it was probably like mid to late teens, probably more like late
Mhm.
teens, uh, when I said to myself, "Well, where can I get comics published if I wanted to draw them?" I think that was probably a barrier. It's really interesting uh, when people ask me these questions in interviews because I normally am not self investigative enough to think about this sort of
Yeah,
stuff until somebody asks me, and it probably was a barrier to me that um, I didn't know how you know where would it get published? I might as well not draw it, sort of thing, you
yeah.
know.
Mhm.
Until I saw an ad in the paper saying we're doing a youth insert to the local newspaper. We're looking for contributions. Do you like to write or draw? So I said I'll draw comics, and they said okay. And that was probably the first time that I actually started to do the sequential stuff because there was actually a an avenue for it to get printed.
Mhm.
A bit weird for me, right? That unless it's going to be printed, why am I bothering to draw it? I guess was
Yeah.
not that I wasn't drawing; I was drawing heaps, but not actual sequential pages or
Mhm.
strips.
That's cool.
Wow, that's probably the first time I figured that out. Thanks for asking that one, Iurgi.
No worries. Now, you were also instrumental in getting the Ledger Awards, which are now renamed the Comic Arts Awards of Australia.
Yeah.
So you were instrumental in getting that started. So could you talk to us what prompted you to start the awards, what it was like to get them started?
Yeah. So uh, we'll take a couple of steps back. A few years, I think about 5 years before I tried to get the Ledger Awards up, Gary Challoner, one of Australia's greatest comic book artists
Hmm.
um, and writers, had already created the Ledger Awards, and they ran for 3 years. And every year that he ran it, they were slightly different. And you know, he was trying to find his feet, I think, as to how to make an Australian Comic Book Award work properly. And at the time, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he was saying something like, "We are good enough. We should have our own awards. Why aren't we acknowledging the level of talent in this country?" And that's why he started it. So that ran for 3 years, and for whatever reason, it stopped. And I was pretty, not that I like to talk about it much, but I was pretty heavily involved with Supernova and the creation of Supernova, the comic convention here in Australia. And I tried very much to be involved with the comic book side of that and look after the comic book people, the artist alley aspect of it, and that kind of thing. And I thought this is the time, now that there's a comic convention, and now that it just looks like there is such a huge wealth of comics being made, quantity and quality. I think it's time again that we had an awards to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
To help people see that there is great stuff, to give people a reason to get together and celebrate just how great Australian comics are. So I used Supernova as a platform to at least begin that. We broke away from that pretty quickly for reasons I won't go into. But so your question is why the Ledger Awards? Because Australian comics are world class, and yet we don't get a look into the other awards unless, you know, we really, you know, are out there on the international stage. So the books that are not on the international stage should also get that spotlight. So, and part of the thing with the Ledger Awards, which are now, as you say, the Comic Arts Awards of Australia, is to make every comic on an even playing field. So whether you're an internationally distributed artist or writer for Marvel Comics, you know, the biggest publisher in the world, or whether you make a mini comic that's only sold at zine fairs, you're being looked upon by the judges in the same way, which is this an exemplary piece of work? Not what are your sales, not how many awards have you already won, not how famous are you, but is this an exemplary piece? So that's why, like, mini comics, which people have never heard of outside of the zine fairs of the city that it's been sold in, have been shortlisted and even won, you know, bronze, silver, or gold, alongside, you know, people who have got international deals with Marvel, DC, etc. And that was probably, you know, I think one of the most important aspects of the Ledger Awards, when we were coming up with the idea of how to figure out what the award structure was. So to go back again, when I said let's do an awards, Gary Shallon, I got wind of it, and said, "Can I help?" And I said, "Thank God, yes, please," because it's a lot of work. So the more brains, the better. And I'm pretty sure it was actually his brain that came up with the idea of that methodology. It doesn't matter the page count or the production method. You get gold, silver, or bronze on just the quality of the work as it stands, not versus something else, right? It's just look at it by itself. Is this exemplary? Is this an amazing piece of comics creation? Then it's deserving of an award. Still something that we have to drill into the heads of the judges every year. Like, it's a hard thing to get your head around, because people go, well, I'm not going to vote for this one, or put this one on my list. Rather, I'm not going to put this one on my list because it's not as good as this one. But it's like, you know, if X wasn't on your list, would Y be on it? Yes. Well, then just put both on there, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. Our goal, it's not like we give away one gold per awards. Sometimes we give away more, and it could be as many as 10. You know, if there are that many comics produced in a single year that are worthy of the gold, then they should all get gold.
Yeah, it is a totally different methodology, and yeah, I remember Bruce Muttard explaining it to me, and I was like, okay, that's very different, but it's really interesting, and definitely it's something that sets the the Comic Arts Awards of Australia apart, in my opinion.
Mm.
So I hope that doesn't change. Yeah.
Yeah,
And you're talking about mini comics, and I'm like, I've got mini comics right here, because
fantastic.
I was at the Festival of the Photocopier just a couple of weeks ago. So I bought this, and I bought a few zines, and
Yeah, definitely. I spend more money at a zine fair, at a large zine fair like Other Worlds, or I don't know if the MCA is still doing theirs, but like Other Worlds zine fair in Sydney is pretty big. It's very big. I spend more money there than I do at a comic convention because there's so much stuff I've never seen, and it's so interesting and exciting. And I really feel like interesting
same here.
compared to what I was, yeah, interesting compared to what I was saying before about when I was younger, it was superheroes or nothing. It's like I need as much interesting, different ways of making comics, in front of me as possible to keep
Yeah.
me, seeing the possibilities.
Same here. I spent more money there than I've spent at Supernova in the last I don't know how many years put together.
Mm.
If you leave out the ticket, which is expensive enough.
Yeah.
Anyway, you're still involved in the committee actually for the Platinum Award, I think.
Yeah.
For
So
those who don't know, could you tell us what it is and its importance?
yeah, so Gary and I ran it for quite a while, and a few people have run it since then, since we retired. But I've stayed on the Platinum committee. So the Platinum is an award given basically for community service. So it's given to people who or entities. It doesn't have to be a person. It can be an event or something, given uh, for efforts to advance the comics medium and the comics medium specifically in Australia. So that's again another weird sort of thing that needs a little bit more explanation to the judging panel. But it's given to people or entities that are selflessly trying to advance the cause of Australian comics.
Yeah.
So it's been given to like one of the early ones was Squish Face Studios. One of the recent ones was Paper Cuts Festival. We often have in our head, let's not just give it historically. It's good if we can give it to something that's actually a going concern, or perhaps an event or an activity that looks like it needs some more encouragement, to keep going, do it again, do it again.
Yeah.
Here's a piece of wood to tell you what you're doing is important and you should keep doing it. So it takes a bit of thought. We have a bit of a discussion every year because the people on the panel are mostly people who have received the award in the past, and because mostly we're kind of concentrating on what it is that we're doing and making in our immediate environment. We don't always know what's happening around the rest of the country, so we also get people to nominate via the website, who or what they think would be a valid person or entity to look into.
Yeah. No, it's a really important award, and it's great to see like the organizations you mentioned. I remember the Comic Arts Workshop as well, receiving it, and what they do is amazing, and the graphic novels that have come out of that program is just so. Yeah, it's really, really valuable. So excellent. Now, before we get into Greener Pastures, because obviously we need to talk about that, but you've been around for a very long time, and you've been talking about all these things, and you've been involved in the awards as well and all that. So, I thought that maybe it'd be interesting to hear, from your perspective, how has the Australian comic scene or community? I often hear that, creators prefer to talk about the Australian comics community. How has it changed? How is it evolving from your perspective?
Yeah. So again, like I was saying, when I was much younger, it was very hard to know what was happening in other states or cities because there was no internet. It was really fantastic when you would stumble upon a mini comic or something that was being made in Ballarat or Perth. From me in Sydney, these places are almost mythological. They're so far away, and you go, wow, this is from Perth. This is amazing. They're making comics there. This is an incredible piece of work.
Yeah.
So again, that collector kind of excitement happens. You go, oh my God, there's stuff I've never seen before. And now it's like it's on the internet. So you can easily or more easily find out, what the scene is like in any place in the country. But as a creator, it was really interesting to watch that like Cyclone Comics kind of launched at the Opera House comic convention way back in whatever that was, 1989 or 1990, I think, whatever it was. And there were comics happening, but not a lot of them. And then OzCon happened. So not OzComic-Con, but OzCon, which was made by King's Comics. And that ran, I think, from like 1990 for about 7 years. And in that period, I don't know if it was a coincidence or whether it was the spark, but that's when the 1990s, like real black and white boom in Australian comics happened. That's when Greener Pastures, Platinum Grit, Platinum, Bug and Stump, Issue 1, Cyber Swine, Zero Assassin, Hairbutt Depot, did I say that one already? Anthology, all of these black and white comics with newsstand distribution all happened in that period.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether or not it was because there was a convention once a year for us to go to as well that really kind of sparked that, brought interstaters together, but also showed us that there were fans and what the fans wanted. I think issue 1 actually predated it by a year or two. Because once OzCon finished, again, was it a coincidence that the people that or the comics I just mentioned and the people who were making them, was it just a coincidence they were all about the same age and we just didn't have the time anymore? But after OzCon stopped happening, Australian comics like fell into a bit of a trough again, and there was very few regular kind of comics like that. There were some. I've got to make sure that I don't say there weren't any. Just because I wasn't making comics doesn't mean there weren't any. But it was a much quieter period. And then when Comic Fest and Supernova, and then after that OzCon happened, it seems like that was the really big explosion of like there is so many comics now. I went through a period. It wasn't a period for most of my life. Once I discovered Australian comics, if I saw an Australian comic, I would buy it. So I had every Australian comic I'd ever seen up until a point where I just said to myself, there are too many now. Like I can't buy one of everything anymore. I'm not the National Library. I just can't buy one of everything. So it got that big, and it became that much more accessible, I guess, as well. And again, I think part of that was zine fairs as well. All of a sudden, there was a lot more comics that I'd ever seen because people had the example of someone going, "Here's my comic," and you would buy it. You go, "This is just on photocopy paper. I could do that." So next year, there's 5 more people because they're going, I made one because I could see how easy it was. And then there's 5 more from each of those. So that exponential growth is like because of a regular comic convention or conventions, the rise of zine culture as a great cultural and creative methodology. I think because manga, the anime influx, and then manga because of that, and then the fact that to be kind of coarse in my language, girls started reading comics. It's like all of this just expanded comics at about the same time. And that's got a huge correlation in Australia and the way Australian comics kind of reacted to that as well. It's fantastic. It's like it's never been a better time. And that again is why the Ledger Awards or the CAAAs, are an important thing now as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think what you said there about festivals is really, really important. And zine fairs, but also in the last few years, what we've seen with the Perth Comic Arts Festival and Paper Cards, we need festivals like that are dedicated to comics and just comics, I've been lucky to go to the Perth Comic Arts Festival twice. and yeah, I was just amazed, to
Mm,
see that room full of people who are just selling comics.
yeah,
And to see the whole variety of them, it's just it's really amazing. It's beautiful and really inspiring. And you
yeah,
think, okay, Australian comics are doing well, and there are lots of them, and they've got a future. And I think also, the awards, of course, are really important for that as well.
mm,
And we don't have the budget to give an award, but for libraries, we thought, when we started as a group, one of the things that we thought as well was, well, there are so many Australian comics, but there are also lots of them that we can't get at the library.
mm,
But if we look at which ones are available, like libraries, usually you need like a perfect bound thing, ISBN
mm,
number, and it needs to be available through library suppliers and things like that. And if we look at which ones are available, and we produce a list ourselves, which is not competing with the awards, it's just for libraries and to say, look, from last year, these are the graphic novels by Australian creators that you should have a look, and you should have on your shelves. And a little bit like with the awards, we don't do bronze, silver, and gold, but we do the long list and we do the short list. There are no winners. We just
mm,
do the long list and the short list, you know, because some libraries will have the budget to buy all of them, and they should, in my opinion.
mm.
But if you have budget constraints, which is understandable, these are the ones that you absolutely must have.
Yeah. I
That
think it's
that's
really important to have a body like Alia uh, to do the thinking for some people who may not have the time or the expertise to look into it themselves. That's a great thing. Absolutely.
Yeah, we're trying, and we get emails, and I've noticed that a lot of the emails that we get asking for help are from librarians, from school libraries. Where very often it's probably the only librarian in the school,
Mm,
um, and they don't have as many resources, or limited budget, and also some rural libraries as well. So yeah, and that's why everything that we do as well and we compile, we just make it available freely, publicly available.
fantastic. Yeah,
That's
very
our
good.
ethos. So yeah. Anyway, enough about us. Um, your comics. Now, Greener Pastures. The original run was from the early 90s
Yeah.
to about 1998, if
Hmm.
I'm right. And
Hmm.
it was published in Australia and internationally as well. Um, what was it about, and why did it end after 7 issues?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, uh we do floppies, right? So
Yeah.
we do so that's number six. So which was the way to do them back then, right? That was you wouldn't release a graphic novel like straight out of
Hmm.
the gate. Um, And the thing is, again, one of the big differences between now and then was that we had newsagent distribution, which meant we would print between 8 and 10,000 copies, most of which would go to Gordon and Gotch to distribute nationally through newsagents. In fact, internationally, because some of them would go to New Zealand and that was where we got most of our fan base from. It was fantastic to be getting fan mail from country towns because somebody gone to the newsagent and picked up these weird comics and then realized that they were Australian made. That was a really important thing for a lot of
Hmm.
people in remote areas, and that just doesn't happen now. Newsagents just don't want comics, so that's not an option. And the idea would be that you would do your serialized story, and then you would collect them, which we never quite kind of got around to, so that if anyone wanted back issues, they could read the stories that way. Um, so I say we because I work with a writing partner, Michael Michelandos. So we were making Greener Pastures. It started, I'll just very quickly kind of go over this. We started it as a comic strip in his university newspaper, and that ran for a year, ran for 12 episodes, which was really cool. I really enjoyed that time, and the story was great. He and I came up with the story together. I actually was on a farm and saw cows and bulls looking very bored in the fields, and had the first like 4 pages of what's now the comic come to me like there and then on the farm. And when we got home from the holiday, I said to Michael, how's this for an idea for a story? And he took that idea and has turned it into like this massive epic, which we're still trying to tell. So after we did that comic strip and he graduated from uni, we couldn't do that for the uni paper. So we said, let's make it a comic book and we'll start from the beginning again and retell it. And that's what we've been trying to do ever since. Yeah. So the reason why we got to 7 issues, in fact, we got to 7.5 issues because we do these weird things called half issues. So 7.5 was the last issue. Was because life was just getting too busy, and there was no money in it at the time. It's just extremely time-consuming activity. Comic making is extremely time-consuming. So I had a couple of kids and a mortgage and a job, and it became hard. So Michael and I, whenever I thought I probably had the time to do it, I would say, Michael, let's get back into it. And he'd say, I actually don't have the time right now. And then anytime he said, I've got time to do it, I'd say, I don't at the moment. Yeah. And we just never been able to synchronize until just recently. We've kind of synchronized. And it's possibly because our kids are now adults, and our careers, or he's got a career. I don't really have a career, but our work lives are kind of stabilized enough that we can find a way to do this. So that's why we're back at it. So yeah, number 7 was the last full issue. And this is not the final cover, but number 8, that was the preview edition for number 8. Number 8 follows directly on from number 7. So it's like 27 years later in between issues. But in Trevor, that's the main character, Trevor, in his life, it's like 24 hours later. So it's still set in 1997. And we've relaunched it. So that was actually first written in 1997, number 8, and we're publishing it in 2024. And I thought that would be an interesting bridge because it was written and I'd thumbnailed it, but we never got around to publishing it or drawing it up properly and publishing it. I thought that'd be an interesting bridge to the new stuff because we've got, that's number 8. We've got 9, 10, and 11 already written, and they're all set in 1997. We've got 12 onwards set in the 2020s, and Trevor is then in those issues is a middle-aged man, or middle-aged minotaur, sorry, and we're kind of following whether or not his decision to leave the farm, whether he's still happy with that as a decision or not. I suppose I've kind of skipped the idea of the story. The story is Trevor is a bull on a farm who's just so bored with farm life that he just knocks on the farmer's door and says, I'm bored, can I come in? There must be something else to life. So he's the only animal character in the book. I've actually had somebody ask me recently, what do you know about furry comics? Like, I don't really know that much. It's not like I make furry comics. I make comics. And in this comic, the main character is an anthropomorphic bull, but everybody else is a human. It's not like that's what I focus in on. It's that's the character, and it's an important part of the story, the fact that he's a bull and nobody else is, and nobody seems to realize he is, and how does that affect him psychologically, and why
he's learning about life.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the reason why we started it. We needed a cipher to act for the reader in our commentary, right? It's a satire, especially at the beginning. It was very much a satirical comic, kind of subtly, making commentary about different things, right? And we needed somebody who was naive and inexperienced to be able to allow that to happen. and that was Trevor.
Yeah.
So that it becomes a lot more than that. So I said to you, I gave to Michael the idea of this bull who's so bored that he wants to leave the farm. What do you think of that as a story? And the next time he and I got together, Michael gave me this, I think it's like 3 little paragraphs of Trevor's entire life story from that point on. Like he'd written this entire kind of idea, which we always wanted to tell. It's that Greener Pastures has a beginning, middle, and end, and we're not even near the middle yet. So, but we want to tell this story, and that's why we're kind of back on it. So a few more stories set in the 1990s before we get to the large epic, which if you happen to pick up Gary Challoner's Adventure Illustrated comics, Adventure Illustrated 1 and 2, which I had some pages in both of those comics. Actually, here's one here.
Yeah.
So that was Adventure Illustrated 2. That's actually the middle-aged Trevor. So you kind of got a bit of a preview of what's going to be coming up in a few issues' time with a middle-aged Trevor who's now a lawyer and not very happy about being such.
Yeah, so this is really cool because not only you're making a comeback, but you actually have a very clear and ambitious plan, I should say. Now, issue number 8, which is the one now on Kickstarter, or by the time this comes out, maybe the Kickstarter's just finished, we'll see. But yeah, if it's still live, check it out. You have an incredible roster of artists in that issue. What was it like, contacting and getting all these artists on board, to make this very special issue? Because every page is a different artist.
Yeah. Nearly every page is a different artist. I've actually got 6 pages in there, but every other page is by somebody else. So the idea was this whole idea of the bridge from the last time we did something to now, such a long period. I mean, we have done a couple of mini comics and short stories, but really as an ongoing thing, it's been such a long period. I wanted to make a bit of a splash. I wanted to have a bit of a party. I wanted to make it quite, quite a big deal in as many ways as I could, right? So I thought, let's do a jam comic where the story's written. I do thumbnails so everybody knows what is on every page, but every new artist has got a different page to do, and they can do it in whatever way that they want, as long as they get through the amount of story that they have to for that particular page. So that the pages all sync up. Sometimes a jam issue where people are able to do whatever they want, it just becomes disjointed. But this actually flows really well, and the people who have read it so far are actually surprised just how well it flows, even though the type of art changes dramatically throughout. So one of the secrets to that was that I inked the entire thing. So everybody gave me pencil drawings, which is, a method that is often used. You draw in pencil and you go over it in ink. So everybody gave me their pencils and I did the inks over the top to try to give some sort of consistency, some sort of stylistically consistent look to it. I know some people are only listening to the podcast, not watching it, but I'm holding up 2 pages or a double page spread, which are in completely different styles. That's by Erin Hunting on the left and Al Barrianuvo on the right. And, Erin's work is kind of goofy, Bigfoot, cartoon, big eye stuff, while Al's work is quite realistic. He likes to work in a very realistic style. Yes. And they just happen to be on opposing pages. And that's probably, the big introduction, I think, for people that page by page things might change a little bit, but the story continues. Yeah. But it seems to have worked. And it's a really, like you said, it's a really interesting book because of that. Your question was, what was it like working with them? It was like herding cats. This is running like probably nearly 2 years late. This has been in the pipeline for a while. But But it's an amazing experience. As a comic book artist, I actually really love every step in the process. I love thumbnails and trying to figure out how to tell a story.
Mm,
I love the pencils because that's the drawing part of it. I love inking because it's not quite a technical exercise, but it's like this finishing exercise where you're using different parts of your brain to the penciling part of it. So I love every aspect of it.
mm,
But to ink 28 or 29 different artists was really incredible. To not overpower them and make it look like it's Tim's work, but also to try to give that artistic consistency a little bit, was amazing. And to learn stuff was incredible. I've got just there Ashley Wood's page. Ashley Wood is like one of the most incredible artists to come out of Australia. And when I finally got his page, this is one of the last ones to come in. I was so excited. It's such an incredible page. And this is
mm.
one of the things in my own art making process that I lack, like this placement of lots of solid black areas and shadows. And how does that work? And it's too scary. And then to get a page where it forces me to do that, I was going, yes, learn
Yeah,
what you can
yeah,
while you're doing that, please, Tim. There's so much to
yeah.
do. But
Uh,
a couple of pages after that is Dean Rankin, who draws in a very Simpsons kind of
yeah,
style. He's never had anyone ink him before ever, so he was really kind of interested to see what that would look like when I go over his pencils. So
yeah.
incredible
It's a
experience.
really,
I'm
really
really glad I did
interesting.
it.
It's a really, really interesting process, and I think it makes this issue really, really special. And the fact that this is the comeback issue, makes it really,
Yeah.
really special. So yeah, I, I supported the Kickstarter, and
Yes. Thank you.
I'm so looking forward to reading it all. So
Yeah.
yeah,
if if we're in time, just go to kickstarter.com and look up Greener Pastures and look for the dancing bull, and
yes. Absolutely.
please do.
Greener Pastures, Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Now, what is like collaborating with Michael again? I mean, you've been
Yeah.
friends, for a long time. You made these comics, and then, as you said, life took over.
Yeah.
And now you're back again, and obviously you have plans for all these issues and everything. Is this something that you've been talking about all these years?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like I said, that there's always been an ending to do, and just trying to find time in our lives to do it has been the hard thing. So so really interestingly, right, there was a point at which I said to Michael, how about we get back on the Greener Pastures story? Let's do it. And he said to me, you know what, Tim, I was much younger when I drew when I wrote those comics. We were just out of university. We
Mm.
were writing stories about university age characters, right? That's where the 1990s stuff is set in the university kind of
Yeah.
atmosphere. He said, I don't know that I can write that anymore. That's not me anymore. And it was at that point that I went, oh, you're right. It's understandable. Totally forget it. And it's off. And at that point, I thought we would never make another Greener Pastures comic again. But there's an American comic that was published in the 90s as well called Hepcats. Amazing comic, and it's such a shame that it ended like on this enormous cliffhanger. There was supposed to be another graphic novel that was gonna anyway. It's such a great comic.
Yeah.
Um, but he did a similar thing where he just stopped writing it, and then like 10 or 15 years later, he released a mini comic. This guy is Martin Wagner. He released a mini comic, and he skipped all the intervening years in the characters' lives and just gave us a 10-pager that showed where they were now, all the characters. One of
Yeah.
them was in hospital, two of them got married, blah, blah, blah. And it was really like, again, as somebody who was so in love with the Hepcats comic, to get 10 more pages was fantastic.
Yeah.
And Michael and I were at a comic convention, and we were standing in the middle of the floor, with people everywhere, cosplayers walking by, blah, 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 noises. And there was about 4 or 5 other comic book creators. We were just having a chat, and Michael was standing opposite me. And I said, oh, Michael, by the way, I just saw this thing with Hepcats, blah, blah, blah. What if we decide to not write Trevor in the 1990s and write him middle-aged like we are now and just skip all the intervening years? And he went, oh, yeah. I mean, anyway, just think about that. And we just continued to talk, the whole group of us that were there. And like 5 minutes later, I looked across at Michael again, and he had his head cocked back just a little bit.
Yeah.
He was looking at the ceiling, and he wasn't listening to what was being said. And he was just off with the fairies. And I went, Michael, you're already writing it, aren't you? He said, yeah, I am.
Yeah.
So at that point, like it clicked that we could just skip the intervening years. Where is Trevor now? And that's where what I was referring to as a working title, Greener Pastures, The End, that's where that script came from. So that script is fully written. I've got it here in my drawers somewhere. It's a script about this thick. That's the typed out script. It's huge. He said, there'll be 3 issues. I went, okay. And then I got what was supposed to be the first issue. I said, there's 3 issues just in your first issue there, Michael. And then he gave me the second chapter. We stopped calling them issues. And there's like 5 issues in this. Oh, yeah, probably 4 or 5 issues in the second chapter. So there's quite a few issues to go, but it explains why Trevor is what he is and how he came to be and what is he and his mates going to do about it.
Yeah.
So it's a very personal story as well for Michael. It talks a lot about him because he's a lawyer. Talks a lot about him in his work and how he feels about the work that he does, and you know, so it's very intimate in places, very personal, but it's also going to be a huge epic. And I hadn't thought about that word ambitious until you used it. You're saying it's very ambitious what Tim's doing. I'm going, oh my God, that's the exact word. It is very ambitious.
Sorry. It's very doable.
It's a good word.
It's very doable.
It is doable. I've got a plan.
Yes.
So I'm hoping that within the next few years, we'll get that story done. I don't know what I'll do with my life if I don't get this story finished. It's been around for so long, and it's such a great story. From the first time Michael gave me those 3 paragraphs, I wanted to have the 2 of us tell that story.
Yeah, that's really cool. So let's talk a little bit about that actually. So you've got the Kickstarter for issue number 8 now, but you're also working on other issues and also a graphic novel.
Yeah, so the idea is that we're going to continue, because I'm an old man and I like my old-fashioned ways. We're going to continue doing it as floppies, but we are going to be collecting the floppies into trade paperbacks. And as we go, I think those trade paperbacks will get thicker and thicker because the story will need a thicker. So anyway, this year on Kickstarter, we're releasing 8, 9, and 10 floppies. And then at the end of the year, we're going to collect the first 4 issues into a trade paperback. So I've still got a few copies of the first 4 floppies, but they're running out. I've actually got only very few copies of number 2 and number 4 left. So at the end of the year, the only way to get them will be in the trade paperback, I would say. Yeah. So trade paperback reprinting of 1 to 4. Next year, I want to do a trade paperback of 5 to 8 because they both make really good arcs. They're a really good kind of encapsulated story as a volume 1 and a volume 2. And then the subsequent trade paperbacks will be 9, 10, and 11, which will be the end of the 1990s era. And then from that point on will be the big graphic novel ending to the story, which will release in chapters. There's 5 chapters. Each one will be slightly thicker than the last.
Yeah.
Again, so I'm finishing the singles. Then we'll collect them as trade paperbacks, probably on an annual basis. So the trade paperbacks will be able to go into libraries, right?
Yes, well, exactly. So, obviously, when you release the trade paperbacks, they'll be on Kickstarter initially, I imagine.
Yes, yeah.
But then you're going to make them available to stores and library suppliers and things like that?
Awesome. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I can't wait. That's really exciting. That's really exciting. I remember actually talking to you. I think it was I think it was at PCAF maybe in 2022. And you had, were you there?
Yeah, that
I
would be
think you
right.
were.
Yeah,
Yes.
22. Yeah.
And I remember talking to you, and you had for Greener Pastures, I was ready to buy them, but um you had one or two issues missing. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Tim, I can't buy this. You
Yeah,
know?
we did so well at that show. PCAF is amazing, but yeah, by
Yeah.
the end of the trading day, we had several issues sold out. It was great.
Yeah. So I'm like, I'm sorry, but I can't buy it because I
Yeah,
can't read the full story. So I'll
totally.
wait. I'll wait. I'll
Yeah, yeah,
wait. And
yeah,
now I'll be able to read everything. So
yeah,
that's really
exactly.
exciting. So I've read bits and pieces and I really like what I've read. So
Thank you.
yeah,
I've look, I find this is like I'm not when I'm on a platform like this, on a podcast like this, I find it hard to talk about how great we are, right? Because it just it doesn't feel comfortable to talk like
yes,
that. But when I'm at a convention, you're playing salesman, so you have to say how great the comic is, obviously. But I if people are kind of umming and ahhing about buying comics, I say buy the first issue. It's a pretty low investment cost wise. Buy the first issue, but read it at lunch because you're going to come back and buy at least three more, if not everything on the table. And they do
yeah,
every time, or almost every time. If they read it at lunchtime,
yeah,
they will come back. If they've only bought the first one, they'll come back and buy up to four, up to number
yeah,
four. And I try to sell one to four as a lot because, like I said, it makes a really great arc. Um,
yeah,
and I say again, read them at lunchtime because you want to come back and buy the rest. And they do because the story is so engaging, it's funny, and it's heartfelt. And we don't play up the whole cliffhanger thing, but you want to know what happens next in Trevor's life. And so like that's the unbiased evidence that if I say come back, you'll want to come back. They do
yeah.
because it's a really good story, and I'm glad that we're able to make a good story.
Yeah. Excellent. And it's very exciting for libraries. Take note that yeah, there will be trade paperbacks coming up and
Yeah,
then finishing with the graphic novels. So
yeah,
we're gonna hear from you guys for the next few years, definitely.
very exciting.
And so at the end, actually, we always like to ask for two or three comics or graphic novels you'd like to
Two
recommend.
or three, cool.
Yeah, and it can be something that you read recently and you're like, oh, this is a really good one, people should read, or something that
Mm,
was an inspiration or an influence for Greener Pastures, or
yeah.
just your
So
all-time favorites, whatever you want.
yeah, I meant to grab a copy of Cerebus because I know I've got one lying around somewhere, but I must have put it away. So Cerebus is probably the biggest influence on my artwork, my storytelling style, and I don't. It's collected in big volumes, and it's one of the greatest comics I've ever read in my life. There's quite a few volumes, like it's about this thick when you put them all together, and it's
Yeah,
one continuous story. Um, Two-thirds of that is like absolutely amazing. I find the last third kind of hard going, but Dave Sim is the creator, and I know that there are issues with talking about Dave Sim, but as a piece of work, it's an incredible piece of work. But from Dave Sim's own admission, the story actually ends two-thirds of the way through, and the last third really is an epilogue, which is part of the reason why I find it drags. Um, but
mm,
there are two parts of that: High Society and Church and State Volume One and Church and State Volume Two, which are really are you know three of the most amazing volumes of comics I've ever read in my life. And I had Church and State Volume Two lying around here in the
yeah,
studio for a while, and I don't have it. But anyway, that's number one. Cerebus
yeah,
is it's hard to get into because it's a product of its time, in that it makes satirical reference to a lot of comics of the time.
yeah.
But there's also a few socio-political issues with the writer artist as well.
Hmm.
But it's absolutely worth reading regardless. It's just incredible piece of work.
Yeah.
I won't talk much about Bone because Bone is, everybody knows what Bone is, but that again is like one of those 1990s black and white comics that was just, amazing to discover at the time.
Yeah.
I read Monsters a little while ago. Barry Windsor Smith's Monsters, definitely not a book for kids. It is so intense. But in all honesty, I feel like this is probably the best comic I've ever read in my life. It's so amazing. And it's nice and thick. And it's so immersive. I just love it. I've always loved Barry Windsor Smith since the first time I saw his work on Conan the Barbarian in the late 70s.
Same.
But if this is the last thing he ever does, which he's kind of saying is the case, Barry Windsor Smith's Monsters is like what a way to go out! Incredible.
I actually when that was announced, I was so excited, and then I requested it for the library, and I remember getting an email back saying, "This is really, really expensive. Are you sure?" And like, no, we must have that.
Yeah,
It's gonna be one of the most important comics released in I don't know how many years. This is a magnum opus. Definitely, we need to
100%.
have it. Yeah.
Oh, what a
It's
piece of work!
amazing.
I love it so
Amazing.
much.
I remember reading it. I finished it. I waited a couple of days, and then I read it again,
Yeah,
but really slowly. The second time, I was like, I'm gonna actually luxuriate in every panel, and
and
every
just
page.
trying to pick apart the story construction as well, and going, oh, he did say this before that to lead into something that happens 400 pages later or whatever. So well constructed. It took him like 30 years or something to make it, 20 or 30 years. I remember when I was lecturing in comic books at the Uni of Western Sydney, like 20 years ago, I was using panels from it that he'd already drawn, as a coming soon sort of thing, which, was 20 years later coming soon. I don't feel so bad that mine's 30 years later. The other one is From Hell from Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell. Again, I really feel like this is one of the best comics I've ever read in my life. I love the fact that the comics I really like now are like huge, big hunking volumes.
I was just about to comment. You've got beautiful omnibus editions.
Yeah, I love them like that. I love them like that.
Yeah.
So,
Excellent recommendations.
they are my recommendations. Yeah. And on top of that, look, just really quickly, I don't read comics as much as I want to anymore. It's so hard to find the time. And I finally got around to reading a few volumes of Tom Taylor's Nightwing. I still enjoy a good superhero comic every now and again. And because I don't read them very often, it often feels fresh to me, even though other people may not feel like it's fresh. I really enjoyed Tom Taylor's Nightwing. I thought that was really cool. And I read Chris Gooch's Under Earth. Finally got around to reading Under Earth, and I thought that was really good as well. Great fun, pretty intense in places. That was a really well made comic. So they were like two of the latest things I've read.
Well, you need to read the new one, In Utero.
Yeah,
it's
I'm very keen.
really good. I really loved it. Really enjoyed it. And I love that you mentioned that about Tom as well, because I don't read many superhero comics these days, but occasionally I pick up some here and there just to see what's going on. And I always enjoy his comics, and they're always really fun to read. And as I mentioned in the podcast just recently, with Nightwing, I really feel like he's actually, him and Bruno Redondo, they're really making something really special. I enjoy everything he does, but this one I feel it's something really, really special. And I'm so sad that they recently announced that their run is going to finish.
Yeah. No, it was good fun. I'm glad I'm finally getting around to it. I've done 2 volumes. I'm keen to go into town and buy a 3rd volume. And it's nice to just read. I love the
fact that they're also having fun with it, and
absolutely
they're trying different things, and they're experimenting, with some of the issues, and See,
this is one of the things with serialized comics, right? Like Nightwing comes out once a month, Cerebus would come out once a month. I'm going to try to get my comics out, once every 2 to 3 months. Being serialized enables you to say this little capsule of 20 pages, I'm going to experiment in a certain way for just this little period. When you collect them, it starts to, maybe it feels like a little bit jarring, but on that, issue by issue basis, it's actually really interesting. The experiments that Dave Sim did in Cerebus, he once did an issue where it was like just reading it, it's like a fever dream, and you're trying to figure out what's going on until somebody figured out that if you take all the pages, photocopy them all and stick them all together, it turns into one huge meta image. And the story is taking place in this huge image, right? So that kind of experimentation is harder to do in a full graphic novel. Asterius Polyp was a great experiment in lots of different ways of storytelling. I'm pretty sure that was Musicelli, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure he said in the past that was part of the reason for doing it, was to experiment with different ways of telling a comic story. But that's a bit risky when you're doing a couple of 100 pages in an experimental way, So that's another reason why I'm keen to do this in a serialized fashion. So every so often, if I want to do something that's a little bit different, I can do that. And it's only a 20-page investment rather than a 200-page investment.
That's awesome. Look, it's been wonderful to talk to you, Tim.
Thanks. I'm glad we finally did it.
Yes, we finally did it. Yes. And I personally can't wait for the issues that are coming up and for the trades, because I usually don't buy floppies. I make exceptions every now and then, but I usually don't buy floppies. So yeah, really, really looking forward. And as I said, people just look up the Kickstarter for Greener Pastures, and there's one maybe still alive when this comes out, maybe not, but there are more coming up in the next few months as well, and the trade paperbacks as well for libraries. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.